Lenon Honor, welcome to the Gnostic Media Podcast.
Oh, glad to be here with you. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
And I had met you last month, about 5 weeks ago, in San Diego. And you're from San Diego, and I used to hang out down in San Diego a lot. I'm about 2 hours away, almost to the minute, from San Diego. And so, what I wanted to have you on is at the Paranoia conference. We both presented on mind control. You had presented on cyclical mind control in 9/11. So, I wanted to have you on to discuss that. And today is September 10th, 2014. So, hopefully, we'll get this episode out for tomorrow. Welcome, Lennon.
It's good to be with you, Jan, and I look forward to talking with you tomorrow. Of course, is September 11th, and my work, the central theme of my work, deals with the mind control associated with September 11th. And terror is in season, and there's a definite reason why.
And all right, let's talk about who is Lenon Honor. What is your background, etc. Tell us about you and education, business, all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Lenon Honor, and in the first place, I'm a husband and father. My wife and I have been married for 13 years. We have five beautiful children. The oldest is 10, the youngest is 3, and my primary responsibility is to be the best father that I can be and the best husband that I can be. Um, Interestingly enough, my journey to getting into these types of topics had more to do with my children and wanting to keep them safe from different degrees of mind control programming. And so we can go back about 7, maybe 8 years ago when I really began to delve deeper into research and then started producing my own documentary films on LenonHonorFilms.com. And that really got into symbolism, subliminal messages, analyzing music videos, analyzing pictures that had subliminal messages in them, that type of a thing. And I was studying a lot of other people's work at that time. I should also mention that I attended college for 5 years at the University of California, Irvine, where I studied music. I also got into psychology while I was there, and that's one of the main topics that I delve into these days. And it has been a steady journey.
Who is your professor at UC Irvine?
My music professor at
Your
UC.
your psychology professor.
Oh, Dr. Thomas Parham.
Okay, I don't know that
He
one. I
was,
know a few of the academics down there. That's what I'm asking.
yeah, he was a co-author to the book Black Psychology. He also wrote another book, I think it was African Psychology, that delved into ancient Egyptian or Kemetic psychological concepts as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Oh, no, no problem. Yeah. Now, you're familiar with UC Irvine?
Yeah. Well, I live an hour from there, and one of somebody that I knew who died last year, Marlene Dobkin de Rios. She was a associate professor of psychiatry there. So.
Okay.
And she was also an anthropologist at Cal State Fullerton, et cetera. But, I'm here on rim of the world in the San Bernardino Mountains, so we're not too far away. All right, so let's see. Why don't we talk about, well, you told us how long you've been studying this material. Let's talk about what is fear-based mind control.
Yes. A lot of people tend to focus on trauma-based mind control program. One of the things I've looked at is fear. And the interesting thing is that fear comes out of trauma. So in a sense, they are very much connected, but I wanted to look at the issue of fear and how it impacts the psychological condition of the human species. So for me, I'm dealing with September 11th. I think this is a preeminent case study in terms of how fear can cause people to think on certain lines. Also, it makes people malleable. It makes people accept certain concepts and ideas, and in some cases, laws like the Patriot Act that under normal circumstances they would not have considered as being a viable option. So what I've done in my book is I've looked at September 11th. I haven't approached September 11th from the vantage point of who I believe did it and why. My approach delves into the psychological implications of the event itself, the trauma of the event, and therefore, in that the trauma brought forth extreme levels of fear, I decided to call the concept and the idea the 911 fear-based mind control program, the idea that the fear of September 11th has become a mind control program that has been used by mass media as a tool of psychological warfare, and that at certain points in the year, usually within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th of every single year, there are particular stories that come in the news that triggers that trauma and causes people to become fearful all over again. And that's what I call the 911 fear-based mind control program.
All right, so let's talk about why don't we go into the categories of this trauma fear-based mind control.
Yes, yes. So inside my book, I outline this. I actually have a chart inside the book that shows this, and this is from following mass media consciously for about 4 years now. One of the things that has happened is that when you follow mass media consciously, and what that means is that you literally think about what is being shown. You also, or what is being the stories that are coming out in the news, and you also look at the correlations between other stories that are coming out in the news, and then you also look at the time during the year within which these stories come out in the news. What I found, this was an awesome discovery. I found that during the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th of every single year since September 11th, there were particular stories in the news that triggers the trauma of September 11, 2001, and therefore inducing fear in people. And this is what I call the 911 fear-based mind control program. There's 3 stages of the 911 fear-based mind control program: the installation, which took place on September 11, 2001, the triggering of the trauma, which takes place within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th of every single year, basically on the anniversary. So that will be tomorrow, or excuse me, that will be this 6 weeks. And then the last final stage of it is the installation or reinstallation, which takes place tomorrow. That's when people participate in this morbid death ritual that we call the 911 anniversary. But what I found was by watching mass media closely for about 4 years and looking at the types of stories that were coming out, I realized that within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th, there are particular stories that were coming into the news, and we can put them into categories. And I have outlined inside my book 10 of those categories. Number one at the top of the list is terror threats. And so this is to say that we see a massive infusion of stories about terror threats, potential terror threats within the 6 week period of every single year, 6 weeks period leading up to September 11th of every single year. Stories about bomb threats. Again, all of these particular topics or these categories triggers the trauma of September 11th, a trauma that has been subconsciously submerged within the global population. Number three, stories about Al Qaeda or Al Qaeda affiliates, or Al-Shabaab, or in this case, this year, ISIS. Okay, these stories trigger the trauma of September 11th. And again, they also correlate to each other: terror threats, Al Qaeda, ISIS, terror threats, right? Stories about Osama bin Laden, or what I call the supervillain archetype. They come inside the news. And it's not that these stories don't occur at other times during the year, but what we see is that within the 6 week period, this window leading up to September 11th, we start to see a massive fusion, and there's a steady buildup, and it gets to a frenzy in and around September 11th, and then they slowly fade out again. Number five, issues dealing with Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, / plane problems. September 11th, subconsciously speaking, is interpreted as the greatest of all time in terms of plane problems. So that's why we see a lot of plane problems inside of the news during this 6 week period: plane crashes. The types of stories that have come out dealing with planes under normal circumstances, they would not have been reported on. But because we're in this 6 week period, mass media makes a point to report on these plane problems. As an example, people fighting on the plane about leg space. I mean, why report on that? There's no reason to report on that. But if you're within the 6 week period and any plane problem that you can find, Morgan Freeman lands a plane, let's bring that up and let's talk about that. Plane crashes, anything that has to do with a plane problem is reported on. Number six, national security issues, which is a major issue right now, not just here in the United States, but also in the UK, with potential terror threats coming from ISIS. No evidence of proof whatsoever, but the programming is still issued as a mind control, fear-based mind control programming. Also, there's trigger characters that trigger the trauma. One of the more recent trigger characters is Pastor Terry Jones. Another trigger character this year now being introduced is Jihadi John, or Jihadi Joe, whatever his name is. These trigger characters will trigger the trauma of September 11th moving forward. Number eight, credible but unconfirmed threats, which is a paradox in and of itself. How can something be credible but unconfirmed? And we always hear about credible but unconfirmed terror threats within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th, since September 11th, 2001, and nothing ever happens. But it's not designed to happen. It's designed to simply trigger the trauma of September 11th, 2001. It's all psychological. It's not physical. ISIS is not physical in a sense that there's this ruthless terrorist organization out there determined to rule the world, and they're coming after you and I. No, it's psychological warfare to induce fear in people. So credible but unconfirmed threats, they got it in UK. We have it in the United States every single year within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th. And two other categories: stories about New York City are always brought up, and stories about Ground Zero are always brought up, because in that 6 week period, especially the closer we get to September 11th, stories about New York City and Ground Zero triggers a trauma of September 11th, 2001. And number 10, Homeland Security. You see a lot of stories in the news. Again, they're all interrelated. Al Qaeda threat, ISIS threat, but that's a Homeland Security issue. That's also a TSA issue. That's also a national security issue. So Homeland Security is also brought up a lot within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th. So what people can do, the beautiful thing about my work is that the evidence of proof is always in mass media within the 6 week period. And again, like I said, it's not that these types of stories don't occur at other times in the year, but we do see a heavy concentration of these types of stories in the news. In point of fact, people can go to Google Analytics and they can look it up for themselves and type in these keywords, and you'll see what time of the year that these types of keywords come up the most within the 6 weeks leading up into September 11th, and then just past September 11th, and then also within the 4 weeks leading up to May 2nd. In more recent history over the last 2 years, which has to do with the triggering of the trauma of September 11th via subliminal association as it relates to the supposed assassination of Osama bin Laden. So, in this case, these 10 particular categories are the types of stories that we see inside the news within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th. Nothing ever happens, but it's not designed to happen. It's merely psychological warfare.
All right. And how is the trauma submerged into the subconscious of the global population?
Yes, yes. So that deals with the first stage or the first phase of the 911 fear-based mind control program. That first phase was on September 11, 2001. What took place, and this, see, September 11th is a wonderful case study because this was the first time in human history wherein a global traumatizing event was broadcast in real time. This never has happened before. Not a globally traumatizing event. In other words, prior to September 11th, any traumatizing event was never broadcast globally live. Okay, it may have been broadcast in a city live or maybe even a country live, but not to the world and not to this magnitude. Not the horror, the graphic horror, and the graphic nature of the event. The levels of fear that was produced out of the event, the level of confusion, psychological or otherwise. This was the first time in human history, and outlined in the book that the reason why this was the case was because of where technology had gotten to. You could broadcast information globally live anywhere. In the first time in human history where in this type of a traumatizing event could be broadcast globally over the internet, over the radio, over television, satellite television, cable television. And so this was a very unique type of an event. And just because, and since the event itself was so graphic, it caused a great deal of trauma. Now, understanding just some basic elements of human psychology and let me just take a moment to explain this, that the reason why September 11, 2001, the trauma of the event was submerged within the subconscious mind was because the conscious mind could not, at that time, September 11, 2001, could not adequately process the event itself. And there's three main reasons why. I'll just say this briefly. The first reason has to do with sensory overload. Anyone who has studied mind control, even trauma-based mind control, that sensory overload is one of the gateways, if you will, to mind control. In other words, that if you overload a person's senses, they will develop a level of psychological confusion because the input that they're receiving is too much for them to process.
And so then what would happen under this level of heightened confusion would probably be something like hypersuggestibility.
Absolutely.
Okay. Got it.
Yes, i.e. the Patriot Act. I.e.
Right.
the need for the war on terror, i.e. Osama bin Laden as the mastermind with no evidence or proof whatsoever. Al-Qaeda as being affiliated with September 11, 2001 with no evidence or proof, or even that Iraq had something to do with it. So,
right, of course, yeah.
So
most of the evidence that I've looked into points to Israel and the Mossad, and certainly not to any Islamic or Muslim country or organization, but that's a whole other topic.
Yes.
You don't need to comment on that.
Yes, but we were told, we were told early on September 11th that somehow it had to do with these Muslim extremists.
Right. And of course, what they don't want you to know is that Bush and the bin Laden family were very close for many decades. They don't want you to know that Obama was CIA. Osama was CIA. For a little Freudian slip there, whatever it was. But and they also don't want people to know that. That Al-Qaeda just means database, and it was a list of CIA operatives that they used to fight against the Soviet Union. So these are all, things that are embedded in all of this that they also don't expose to the public. And when you get in and dig deeper, you find these things.
Yeah. So in terms of sensory overload, this particular issue of on September 11th, one of the things that took place was that we were inundated with information, and a lot of it conflicting information. I even write about that inside of the book, how conflicting information compromises our intellectual capacity to define an undefined element. So let me
Well,
just say,
let
yeah.
me interrupt you for a second because I have a note down there further down to discuss that. So, one thing that I noticed when people get conflicting information is that they're not realizing that there is a lie or an error somewhere in the information. If people recognize that a contradiction is a lie or an error, do you think that that would help them process this type of information?
I think that they would be able to at least dismiss certain levels of information, which would probably benefit them in getting closer to the truth. You
Right,
see what I'm saying? So if they know that it's conflicting information, they know that the information is inaccurate, at least they'll be in a position to dismiss that information. The
right,
problem on September 11th was that people were not thinking critically in the first place because of three main reasons. Sensory overload, conflicting information, and then the intellectually stifling emotion of fear. So the need to be able to even ask the critical question whether or not any given information is true was not something that people were doing on September 11th. Most people were
right.
not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, see, in my case, a roommate wakes me up at 6:30 in the morning and says, is screaming and shouting, "You have to get up! We're being attacked! We're being attacked!" I go in the other room. I sit down on the couch. I watch the media for 15 minutes. I say it's an inside operation. And I said, they're faking all of this. And I got back up and I went to bed with my roommate screaming names at me about how inconsiderate and how could I dare say something like that, But, from immediately on the morning of September 11, 2001, I didn't buy it.
Yeah, well, see, most of us we bought it. Okay,
Right.
and some of us we may have had an idea that something didn't seem quite right, but most of us bought it. So the three issues in terms of people's inability to process the trauma of September 11th and it being submerged within the subconscious mind, there were three main reasons. Sensory overload, that's when you receive too much information. And when your conscious mind it receives too much information, it can't do what it normally does, which is to define an undefined element and to solve a problem. In this case, September 11th. That's the undefined element. The problem is also September 11, 2001, these terror attacks that were unfolding right before our eyes. So in real time, we were faced with this major challenge of trying to define an undefined element and solve a problem, but we were also having this level of sensory overload, too much information, a lot of it conflicting information, the images being shown all over again, over and over again. This is all trauma-based programming because it's just a traumatizing event being broadcast and then replayed over and over and over again. Therefore, our senses were overloaded. What happens is that when the conscious mind can't define an undefined element or solve a problem because the senses are being overloaded, it experiences a level of psychological trauma. And therefore, the subconscious mind kicks in, takes that trauma, and submerges it within the subconscious mind. Well, this is precisely what took place on September 11th for most people. Maybe not so much for you, but for most people. I will admit
Well,
that for me, this is what took place.
and in my case, I had been studying. By that time, I had an archive of hundreds of hours of underground news type of information and different type of reporting. And the only thing that September 11th spawned me to do was to start producing that media so that other people had quicker access to it. Why don't we get into what is the mass media's cyclical programming timeline?
Yes, yes. Now, before I do that, let me just share these other two because
Oh, yeah. Excuse
it will
me.
go
Sorry.
into yeah. So the other two issues as to why it was that we were unable to define the undefined element of September 11, 2001, or to solve the problem in real time live. Okay, so we have sensory overload, but we also have conflicting information. Whenever we receive conflicting information, automatically we begin to experience psychological trauma. In other words, our conscious mind can't say I can define this undefined element because or I can define an undefined element or solve a problem. It cannot do that if the information that it's receiving is conflicting or conflictive. So on September 11th, we received a vast array of conflicting information as the official story began to be, expounded upon. And let me just read just a couple of those real quickly here. Reports of explosions in the Twin Towers prior to their collapse. Okay, that's a conflicting account, but this was an account that was reported on. It's a conflicting account as it relates to the official story. Reports of a car bomb exploding outside the State Department. Reports of a fifth plane crashing at or near Camp David. Reports of missiles hitting the Twin Towers. Reports of missiles hitting the Pentagon. Reports of various makes and models of hijacked planes. Reports of no visible plane debris at the Shanksville, Pennsylvania crash site. And reports that the collapse of Building 7 was a result of fires. That's all conflicting information. And there was so much more conflicting information. So, in other words, what happens is that when the conscious mind receives so much conflicting information, and also the senses are overloaded, we begin to feel, or we begin to experience a level of psychological confusion or psychological trauma, and then the subconscious mind kicks in. The primary objective of the subconscious mind is to protect the conscious mind from experiencing levels of psychological trauma. And then the third reason as to why we were unable to define an undefined element and solve the problem of September 11th in real time, and this is why the event itself was submerged within the subconscious mind. Okay, it wasn't processed consciously. It was interpreted on a subconscious level and embedded within the subconscious mind. The third main reason, and most important reason, is the issue of fear. Fear compromises the intellectual process. When we are in a state of fear, we cannot think critically. So how are we going to be able to define an undefined element or to solve a problem? So these three issues, the media saturation that took place on that day, which is sensory overload, also the conflicting information that causes even more confusion, and then fear, which stifles the intellectual process, is the reason why consciously we did not process, most of us did not process the event consciously, therefore it was submerged within the subconscious mind. Now, in that this trauma is submerged within the subconscious mind, now we get to the cyclical timeline programming. What the cyclical timeline programming simply is that mass media, the way that it reports on particular stories, any traumatizing event, is to reissue stories that are associated with that traumatizing event in and around the anniversary of that traumatizing event. And in that September 11th, it's very special because it's the first time in human history that we had a globally traumatizing event being broadcast live, and the global population was traumatized by the event. Therefore, this September 11, 2001, the anniversary of this particular event, is the main event of mass media cyclical timeline programming. So in other words, mass media really puts on a major production so as to trigger the trauma. And what happens is that within this 6-week period, this is the cycle, mass media cyclical timeline programming, you start to see these stories about terror threats, bomb threats, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, et cetera. We talked about that earlier. And it triggers that trauma that is submerged within the subconscious mind. And people, like right now, today is September 10th. We're going to September 11th. People are anticipating, tomorrow, September 11th, people are anticipating some type of a terrorist attack. People are fearful right now. But really what's the issue is, it's nothing physical. It's all psychological warfare. That the issue is that their trauma is being triggered unbeknownst to them, and the trauma is submerged within the subconscious mind. What I hope to do is to illustrate to people the program, the 911 fear-based mind control program, and then ultimately they can go through the process of alleviating themselves, alleviating their subconscious mind of this program, so that next year when this type of programming comes out, because it will come out, that's been going on for 13 years now, when it comes out, they won't be impacted. They won't be adversely impacted by the fear-based mind control program, which is a form of trauma-based mind control program. So that's the cyclical timeline programming. And it's not just with September 11th. Any traumatizing event that has happened in recent history, or going back to 100 years ago with the sinking of the Titanic, 102 years ago now, there was on the 100-year anniversary, all these types of stories were coming out in the news about the Titanic, about shipwrecks, all this type to trigger the trauma. For those who have recently watched the movie, or for people who are still holding on to that particular trauma, maybe they knew someone back then, or they watched the movie and they were traumatized by watching this mega blockbuster Hollywood film. All these stories were, and then what did people do? People got together on the anniversary, the 100-year anniversary, and they lit candles, they sang songs, they ate, and they cried, and they mourned about something that took place 100 years ago, and many of them were not born, didn't know anyone on board the ship or anything like that. And then they bring their children along and traumatize their children too. Well, this is no different than September 11th. And the anniversary, what I call the morbid death ritual that people participate, it is a morbid death ritual. People are led to participate. It's not a conscious choice, and it makes absolutely no sense. And then they bring their children along to participate in this morbid death ritual. That's the depths of the programming.
And when you think that at 100 years, the oldest person in the world was, 109 to 113 maybe, so they would have been at most 9 to 13 years old if they were even at this event, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a lot of people that are in the 100 to 105 range that could have been there, but, they would have been 3, 4, 5 years old. They would have
No
had
memory.
absolutely no recollection of it whatsoever.
That's
so.
right.
All right. So, what begins in April and May? Would you talk about, what do they do to lead? It's like they do 2 sessions during the year, and even more, which we'll cover later on.
Yes. So in terms of September 11th, there's also a correlating cyclical program. So we have the 6-week period leading up to September 11th, but we also have this period, the 4 weeks leading up to May 2nd. And this is more recent. This is like within the last 2 years. And the reason why I was able to identify this is because I've been following mass media for 4 years now and watching the cycle, actually a little bit longer than that. But I identified the pattern about 4 years ago. And I'm talking about the pattern of September 11th, the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th. But once I identified that pattern, I noticed that after Osama bin Laden was supposedly assassinated, no evidence of proof that he was.
Well, that was what, the 9th or 11th time, I forgot, that he had been
Yes, of
reported
course.
dead in the media, right?
It's true. And see, that's also conflicting information.
Then, last August, after years of painstaking work by our intelligence community, I was briefed on a possible lead to bin Laden. It was far from certain, and it took many months to run this thread to ground. I met repeatedly with my national security team as we developed more information about the possibility that we had located bin Laden hiding within a compound deep inside Pakistan. And finally, last week, I determined that we had enough intelligence to take action and authorized an operation to get Osama bin Laden and bring him to justice. Today, at my direction, the United States launched a targeted operation against that compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. A small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage and capability. No Americans were harmed. They took care to avoid civilian casualties. After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body. For over 2 decades, bin Laden has been al-Qaeda's leader and symbol, and has continued to plot attacks against our country and our friends and allies. The death of bin Laden marks the most significant achievement to date in our nation's effort to defeat al-Qaeda. Yet his death does not mark the end of our effort. There is no doubt that al-Qaeda will continue to pursue attacks against us. We must and we will remain vigilant at home and abroad. As we do, we must also reaffirm that the United States is not and never will be at war with Islam. I've made clear, just as President Bush did shortly after 9/11, that our war is not against Islam. Bin Laden was not a Muslim leader. He was a mass murderer of Muslims. Indeed, al-Qaeda has slaughtered scores of Muslims in many countries, including our own. So his demise should be welcomed by all who believe in peace and human dignity.
You know,
Right.
And this
Good
is
point.
stuff. And see, this is not something that you're making up or I'm making up. This is stuff that was reported on in the news.
Right. Yeah, it's like, which time? And then they just, they sail his body out into the water, which is totally against Islamic law, and then just leave him out there. And no evidence, no onus of proof whatsoever.
None.
Just completely arguing the arbitrary. And people bought that crap.
Yes, most people, but that's no different than, most people bought September 11th. You
Right.
didn't, but I know I did. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
That's the other thing is I don't come from the vantage point of that somehow, I'm enlightened because I see this program, because there's other programs that I'm sure are running that I've bought
absolutely.
into. You see what I'm
Well,
saying?
and that's why I'm having you on the show, because you present areas of mind control that I overlooked. I didn't ever notice this cyclical fear-based mind control. So, it's important to, and we have done a lot of number of exposés on the CIA's MKUltra program. We've uncovered a lot of material that nobody else had uncovered prior. And we've focused a lot of the show on different forms of mind control. So to me, it's important to have you on, because this is yet one more form of mind control that people can recognize and make themselves immune to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the second cycle that I noticed was within the 4 weeks leading up to the supposed assassination of Osama bin Laden, that similar types of stories come inside the news, because Osama bin Laden, he is associated on a subconscious level with September 11, 2001. So in and around the anniversary of his supposed assassination, stories that as the types of stories that come out deal with the same types of stories that come out during the 6 weeks leading up to September 11. It's not as severe, meaning that it's the frequency at which these stories come out during that 4 week period, and then the amount of stories that come out, they pale in comparison to the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th. But this is another media cycle that people can look towards. So next year, let's say in the 4 weeks leading up to May 2nd of 2015, you'll see stories in the news about terror threats, bomb threats, SEAL Team 6, Al Qaeda, and then now they'll probably add ISIS into the mix because all of a sudden it's ISIS versus Al Qaeda, right? Which one is worse? Okay, you'll see stories about that coming inside the news within the 4 weeks leading up to May 2nd. This also goes to show you that to a great degree, what we find in mass media is nothing more than scripts that are run over and over again. And this is to say that a lot of the stories that are reported on they're just based upon particular traumatizing events that took place in the past, and they're regurgitated time and time again. And once people see that, then when the stories come out, they're not impacted by these types of stories in the same way. I'm not fearful about a potential terror threat. I'm not fearful about Al Qaeda or ISIS because I recognize the timeline programming, and it's perfectly predictable. In point of fact, I went back last year and listened to the radio interviews that I did and so forth and so on, because every year I go on this campaign to go ahead and talk about this specific topic. I upload videos on YouTube. And the things that I said about this issue last year, the year before, and the year before is no different than what I'm saying this year. And every single year, mass media proves my point. So in that sense, there's no need to fear it because it's just a cyclical program. It's just like a script. Once you've read the script or you've seen the script, you already know what's going to take place in advance. And once you know what's going to take place in advance, there's no need to fear.
So you're not a prophet, you just recognize the pattern.
Yes, yes. And I know there's people who have said things like that. No, Lenon, you're psychic. That's not it. Because when we put it into the scope of like the paranormal or the supernatural, what we're doing is we're denying the importance of intellectual process. And I think people need to be very careful about that. It's just recognizing the pattern. I put the pattern in the book. I define the pattern. I give examples of the pattern. And then I allow mass media to prove my point every single year within the 6 week leading up to September 11th. That's not prophecy. That's just understanding the script and writing it down.
It's just looking at the facts. And yeah, I mean, you probably don't have a document that says we're going to start this every year in April and run it through May 2nd and then kick it up again in August and run it through September. But I mean, if you did have an actual document, you could just point at it, but at least you have the program and the cyclical events that keep reoccurring that you can point to and show the repeating patterns. So
Yes.
let's talk about the psychological condition and mind control, the conscious and subconscious mind in relation to time. So let me put it this way. Does the subconscious mind recognize time, and does the conscious mind recognize time? Let's clarify that.
Yes, yes. So in that the conscious mind, its main objective is to define undefined elements to solve problem. Time is always an issue. Consciously, we can say, right now I'm in the present. I can look into the future and have an idea of what may occur. Okay, I can say like in the future I'm going to take a sip of a glass of water, and
I'll join you with some bulletproof coffee here.
all right, and I can make that happen. See, I can also look back into the past, and I can look at events like I met Jan. I met you in San Diego about 2 months ago. Okay, so consciously, I'm aware of time. And so the conscious mind is aware of time. The subconscious mind, however, is not aware of time. It doesn't distinguish between past, present, future. It only perceives everything as if it is taking place in the moment. Now, that holds some profound implications because if, in fact, the subconscious mind has this subconsciously submerged trauma of September 11, 2001, and this trauma is being triggered within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th, the subconscious mind doesn't distinguish between like what's taking place right now and what took place on September 11th, 2001. In other words, the subconscious mind will, in a sense, believe that September 11th is happening all over again, and therefore it's being
happening
re-traumatized.
right now. It's happening tomorrow morning.
Yeah,
Right.
there you go. And that's why right now a lot of people are antsy. You're not, I'm not, but there's a reason why you're not and I'm not. But most people are antsy and they're anticipating a terror attack. But you know what they're really anticipating is September 11th, 2001 taking place all over again because of subconsciously embedded trauma within the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind doesn't distinguish that trauma took place on September 11th, 2001. It perceives it to be taking place right now.
What about the ritual date of September 11? And the September 11 goes back through, I know there's been a number of events in the past. I can't name them off the top of my head that are associated around the September 11 date, et cetera.
Yes, there are historical events that have taken place that we would consider to be traumatizing or even ritualistic that have taken place on September 11th. The other thing I talk about inside the book is like, it's not just trigger stories. It's also trigger digits. It's trigger words, trigger images, trigger videos, trigger movies that triggers the trauma of September 11th. So in this sense, even the date itself, 911, 9-11, 9/11, this all functions as trigger dates that can trigger the trauma. So anytime someone picks up the phone or they think about calling 911 on a subconscious level, the trauma of September 11th, 9/11, it can be triggered as well. So in this sense, the date is significant, and there have been historical events that have taken place on that day that have relevance if people want to look into that. But in terms of my interpretation, what I look for is the numbers and the digits and how the numbers and digits are used to trigger the trauma of September 11, 2001.
Has there been any study done that you're aware of looking at emergency 9/11 phone calls versus, in relation to September 11?
You mean types of conversation that were being had?
Well, no, I mean, like, since September 11, are people less reluctant to call 9/11?
Oh,
Is there
wow.
some psychological trauma related to that, to dealing with 9/11 and calling, the emergency phone number, et cetera?
Wow, that is a remarkable proposition as a case study to kind of analyze.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything. I mean, I haven't even thought of anything like that. But that would be an awesome study to conduct, most definitely.
Well, that's what these interviews are about. We can make some discoveries right here, have some oh wow moments as we progress. So, all right. What are the conscious mind's three major contributors to its instability to define an element? Excuse me while I expand that, or solve a problem.
Okay, yeah. So we talked about this earlier. Conflicting information.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, conflicting. Let me just go over it because just
Okay.
for people's. Yeah, conflicting information, sensory overload, and most importantly, the intellectually stifling emotion of fear. Those are the three elements that compromises the conscious mind's ability to solve a problem or to define an undefined element. And not just with September 11th, this can be applied to any area of our life. Anytime that we cannot solve a problem or define an undefined element, you can look to conflicting information, confusion. You can look to sensory overload. We got too much going on, and we can look to fear mainly as being contributors to our inability to solve problems or define undefined elements.
What made you realize the psychological implications of 9/11?
This is a good question. What I really thought about was, well, on one hand, it was me realizing that I had bought into an illusion on September 11, 2001 with the official version, right? That's one. But then the other thing was that I recognize, because there's psychological implications to that. Because when you look at yourself and you said, why did I believe in that illusion? That's a psychological issue. Okay, no one forced me physically. It's like a psychological issue. So I really had to look at myself critically and how I thought and what I was led to believe without asking any critical questions. So
And
that's
then you
one.
just admit that you're wrong and you kind of laugh it off. Hey, they got me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I kind of laughed it off, but then I was also kind of disappointed in myself. I was like, why did it?
Well,
But
yeah.
then, of course, what did we do? And this is what I think anyone should do. Any good researcher should do. You start to ask critical questions and you start to dig deeper, and then you make sure that you don't fall for it again. Right?
Exactly. And I think that's laughing it off, I think, is key to not being susceptible to it again. Ha, you got me.
That's right.
CIA, this group, that group, you got me. Ha, ha, ha. But if you sit there and you're in denial, you're going to be very susceptible to being caught in it again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then the other issue for me was just seeing people's emotional and irrational reaction to September 11th. Anytime you bring up September 11th, also anytime within that 6-week period, leading up to September 11th, just to see how people's condition. It's not until you step out of the matrix of what I call the 9/11 fear-based mind control program that you really see how many people are still stuck in there. And you can see how their thoughts, their behaviors, their emotions get all riled up, and you realize that it's all externally derived, meaning that there's external stimuli that's being produced to get them to cause that effect. And that external stimuli is the types of trigger stories that come inside the news within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th of every single year. For me, when I began to see people's emotional reaction and seeing how easily people were being triggered, I recognized that it wasn't physical. It wasn't like someone was physically causing these things. It was, even though it was a physiological response or an emotional response, it was that there was something that was being done that had to do with psychology. That there had to have been some type of psychological influencing that would cause a person to have that type of effect on a person. And that's when I really realized that something deeply disturbing was going on. And then after a certain point, once I realized that there was, based upon people's reaction within that 6-week period, that's when I started to really look closely at mass media. And I said, wait a minute, it's these stories that come inside the news and nothing ever happened. So it's not physical per se, it's psychological. It's psychological warfare.
All right, let's go back to what happens to us consciously and subconsciously when we see these repeated images from about 9/11, et cetera, or any other traumatizing event, but in this case 9/11 in the media over and over? What happens when we're constantly getting that repeated barrage each year?
Yeah. So under normal circumstances, any trauma, subconsciously embedded trauma, the subconscious mind will go through the process of resolving that trauma. And it's a perfect arrangement because if you think about it, if we had to consciously think about a particular trauma or undefined element or a problem that we've been unable to solve, and that's all that we could think about for 24 hours a day, we would literally go insane. So there's this arrangement within the human mind, which is wonderful, and that is that instead of us having to focus in on an undefined element or a problem that we've been struggling with for a long time, which would literally cause us to go insane, those particular traumas or that problem is submerged within the subconscious mind, or the undefined element is submerged within the. In other words, the subconscious mind's main objective is to protect the conscious mind from experiencing psychological trauma. And anytime we can't define an undefined element or solve a problem, that's what happens. We get all stressed out, we get all worried, so forth and so on. So what happens is that once a trauma is submerged within the subconscious mind, under normal circumstances, if a person was left to their own devices, the subconscious mind will find a way. And we don't even have to be consciously aware of it. It will find a way to solve a problem or to find an undefined element or to resolve a particular trauma. However, if a person is continuously triggered, if their trauma is continuously triggered, and again, the subconscious mind doesn't distinguish between past and present and future, the subconscious mind will believe that initial trauma is happening all over again. And let's think about that. What that means is that every single time a person's trauma is triggered, that the subconscious mind is reliving the initial traumatization. And therefore, that particular trauma is submerged one more layer deep within the subconscious mind. And therefore, it becomes even more difficult to resolve. The next year, in the case of September 11th, when we get all these stories in the news about potential terror threats, so forth and so on, it triggers that trauma again. The subconscious mind doesn't distinguish between past, present, and future. It believes that September 11, 2001 is happening all over again, and therefore, that trauma is again submerged another layer deep. Now, what has happened is that we now, tomorrow, on September 11, 2014, we will have had 13 years of the layering of this trauma. So now it's 13 layers deep. And therefore, the more layering that takes place within the subconscious mind, the further and further away we get from resolving the initial trauma, because there's other traumas that are packed on top, other unresolved issues or undefined elements or problems that the subconscious mind is working through. So therefore, what happens over time is that as long as the cyclical programming takes place and people are unconscious to it, it will continue to impact their subconscious mind. And therefore, the trauma will continue to be submerged deeper and deeper within the subconscious mind. Once a person becomes consciously aware of it, when the programming takes place, their trauma is no longer triggered because they see what the program is and they recognize it consciously. And therefore, now that initial trauma can begin to be brought back to the surface. And the closer it comes to the surface, the more readily it will be basically processed by the subconscious mind and ultimately resolved.
Is it reasonable to expect people to rationalize all of these images in the media consciously, when they repeat it without having knowledge of the program?
So are you saying that is it possible for someone to do that?
Is it reasonable for us to expect most people to be able to process the information, to rationalize them, without realizing that it's a program?
That's a good question. I think that it's reasonable, but I don't think that it's necessarily. That's a tough question. I'm going to say I don't know. I really don't know. Let me speculate here. And that's an awesome question. I don't know the answer to that. What I can say is that given the depths of this programming, in my mind, it makes sense that it would take a person's conscious awareness to resolve the issue of the cyclical programming, but ultimately that the trauma itself is going to have to be processed on a subconscious level. We can assist. Yeah.
Yeah. What I was just going to say is if they, with the images there, if they didn't have conscious awareness of it without the annual triggers, they would naturally resolve it or just suppress it to a point that it didn't affect them. But with the trigger, what you're saying is that they would need the conscious awareness of the program to resolve it.
Yes, that's it. That's it. So I think you've answered the question yourself, but the question, I think the question, I didn't have the answer to,
right.
But I think what you just said is the answer. Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, that's, we came to it. So let's see. Does all of this create a fight or flight and this barrage of images in the media? Did it create a global fight or flight in the entire world's population?
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about that. Go ahead, talk about
Yeah,
that.
so initially it was a flight response. And this flight response was emboldened by the fact that there were no actions that were taking place on September 11th, let's say by the U.S. military. No action whatsoever. You would think that if a plane crashes into a building and people are talking about as a potential terror threat, that you would have planes in the air from the Air Force automatically right there in New York.
Well, they were too busy doing Dick Cheney's tests right at their whole mock thing right at the exact same time.
Right, but you see that the lack of response, it puts people into the framework of flight as opposed to fight. You see,
Right.
So most of us, what we went into was fight or flight, and most people, well, initially, what took place was that this option of fight or flight. Most people went into flight, and what has happened as a consequence, and again, this is what causes the externalization of power. I talk about this in the lectures, that any given trauma, in this case September 11th, brings forth fear. And out of this fear brings forth the externalization of power. And out of the externalization of power comes forth control. The control is psychological in this case. But what I'm getting at is that the fear that we felt puts us in this mode of fight or flight. And in that most people chose flight. Okay, now what do? We externalize power. Now we think that there's something that is too great for us to overcome. So we externalize power to it. And this has set up this dynamic since September 11, 2001 of supposed boogeymen that we're always supposed to be fearful of, but they never do anything. Al-Qaeda, or Osama bin Laden, and now ISIS. And what I mean by that is that if we think about all of the propagandized potential terror threats that have come in the news since September 11, 2001, and if we ask the question, how many of those terror threats have panned out? The answer would be zero.
Right.
Okay. Now, and yet the effect is still the same. It still re-traumatizes people. It causes people to be fearful. It causes people to externalize power, and that's how people are maintained in a state of control. It's trauma-based control, but it's also psychological in essence. It's not physical in a sense. It's psychological. So as a consequence, what has happened is because people have been led to externalize power, the ramifications has been that now the person or the institutions that are to solve the problems or to define the undefined element or to solve the problem or to bring forth a solution as to this problem of massive terrorism all over the world and these terror groups coming after each and every one of us. Now government steps in. Now the Patriot Act can be passed. Now particular restrictions on flight travel, so forth and so on, can be enacted. Well, that's been a result of
illegal
this type
search,
of
illegal search, all of this stuff. They basically just stripped everything away, and they use the airports as like the model of stripping everyone's rights. So then, people are guilty of a crime before there's any evidence that they created one, and now they can take people's water bottles and toothpaste away.
Well, this is true. That's
All
why
right,
September 11th. Yeah, September 11th is so important for people to understand the implications in terms of and the ramifications of the event, because so much has come to pass because of all of the fear-based programming that came out of September 11, 2001.
Now, regarding or returning to conflict in information and having all of these different, stories and things that we talked about early on, how is confusion psychological trauma itself?
Because confusion causes our conscious mind to be unable, if you will, to define an undefined element or to solve a problem. Okay. So in other words, if you're confused about something, you won't be able to define that something clearly. If you're confused about something, you won't be able to solve a particular problem. You see what I'm saying? So anytime we have a level of psychological confusion, basically our intellectual processes are compromised, and therefore we can't define an undefined element, or we can't solve a problem. We can use an example of September 11th, or we can use an example of an everyday life experience.
Sure. Well, why don't we go into how did the public receive contradictory information on 9/11?
Yes. In the book, I outlined particular examples of this. So let's use this one. Let's use because this is the one that, in my mind, I think that people should really be critical of the type of information that was received. Building 7. Very little is spoken about Building 7. Very few people talk, even people who watch the news on September 11, 2001. See, again, if you're put into the state of fear, you're not going to ask critical questions. You're not going to try to define undefined elements. You've already externalized power, and you just want answers. You want anyone to give you the answer. You want the authority.
Well, you mean like when the British woman is there on camera talking about Building 7 collapsed and it's standing behind her?
Mm-hmm. Is that not conflicting information? You know what I'm saying? That's one of the ultimate. I wish I would have I didn't even put that one in the book. But if people think about it, that's the ultimate conflicting information. A woman is talking about how Building 7 has collapsed, and in the background you see Building 7 standing perfectly, right?
Right.
So what happened on September 11th with Building 7? I think that's an important thing for people to look at, because we were led to believe that this building collapsed in the way that it did because of a fire.
Right. And it was the first metal building in all history to collapse from a fire.
Yes, first time in human
First
history.
time in human history. Right.
So in essence, that is conflicting information.
Right.
Because it defies the laws of physics in essence. People need to think about that. Science, and that's the remarkable. Let me just say this too. It's remarkable the degree of programming is so deep that you have people who are world-renowned scientists who bought into that illusion, and some still buy into that illusion.
Well, and there was a fire in a major skyscraper, last year before, I forget in which country, an Asian country, where the whole top of this building catches fire, and of course the building didn't collapse, and they just rebuilt it and put it together again.
Yes, and normally when a building collapses under those, or no, I shouldn't say collapse, but when a building is demolished, the way that it is settled into the ground is at free fall speed. Well, that's precisely what we see with Building 7.
Right. You don't see it, part of the building falling and then it tumbling. It just perfectly falls straight down into its own pattern.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, so let me just say this: that's conflicting information because it defies the laws of physics. But then also the reason that they defined why it was that the building, basically fell within its footprint at free fall speed, that's conflicting information because it defies logic, reason, and it defies physics. And I think that in and of itself causes psychological confusion, and therefore the conflicting information will cause someone to ultimately experience a level of psychological confusion, which further embeds the trauma within the subconscious mind.
And it's key for people to understand that when they spot contradictions in information, that there is a lie or an error in the information, and then you process it from there. There are no contradictions in nature. There are only contradictions in the minds of humans. So when we understand that, it can give us a big tool for helping us to figure out the truth and what really happened.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said.
What about the issue of trusting a medium that we can't verify the information from ourselves, such as the mainstream media?
Yes, this happens all the time. And one of the reasons why mainstream news always uses legal statements is because much of what is reported on is simply not true, and it's not backed up by facts, independent research study whatsoever. And so what they do is they say things like officials say, experts say, a high-ranking official in the White House says.
Ad veracundium fallacy, appealing to authority.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in the process of appealing to these authorities, do not source an authority's name, does not source the authority's quote. They simply say officials say, experts say. So in other words, to get to your question, people need to be clear about this, that when these types of legals, and I have a whole list of the legal statements inside the book, when these legal statements are used, you should be critical about the information that you are receiving. And these are legal statements in this sense that if you say that an official says, okay, officials report that Al-Qaeda may attack or ISIS may attack on September 11th, 2014 or 2015, 16 or 17 or 18, because it's going to happen again. Okay. If you say officials say, if it turns out that nothing happens, or if you can't back it up with any evidence or proof, the onus is not on you as a reporter. The onus is on the official that you quoted, even though you didn't really give a name as to who the official was. You see the game here? So in other words, it absolves a news agency of any legal repercussions from reporting on disingenuous or uncorroborated information or reports. And this happens all the time inside the news. And people should, again, the critical process. Okay, for instance, on September 11th, you asked critical questions. I did not. Today, 2014, September 10th, people should ask questions when we are given stories and they simply quote an official but do not give a name of the official, and they expect people to accept the story. We should have enough sense to say, wait a minute, where's the evidence or proof of this?
That's exactly right. They need to fulfill the onus of proof, and the onus of proof means, whoever makes a claim, they must supply the evidence to support it. It's not on me to support your claim. It's solely on you, Lenon, to support your own claims.
That's right.
When the mainstream media doesn't provide that citation, doesn't quote the exact person who gave it, doesn't quote the book or the exact source where they got it, then they are failing the onus of proof, which then is known as arguing the arbitrary, and it's dismissed by default.
Very well said. Very well said. And let me just add one other thing here. And that is that the relationship that most people have to the mainstream news is that whatever the mainstream news, you accept it as being fact. But if you go back and you look at, let's say you look at news reports back in, say, the 1960s, they were not allowed to do that. They were not allowed to say officials say and experts say. They always gave a source, and before they gave a source, they confirmed it. If they
Right.
said that something happened, they always gave evidence and proof of it. If in many cases they gave video footage of it that would prove to anyone who had some sense, they would be able to say, "I see what they're saying, and I can identify
Right.
it based upon
Well,
the evidence."
and what was the change? So in the 1960s, we have Vietnam and all of these free roaming reporters that exposed actually what was going on. And
Hmm.
then by the 90s and 2000s, they had embedded reporters so that they could control the image that was being portrayed in the
Very,
media.
very true. So very true. And that's why nowadays you don't have to even give a source. You go back to the 60s, you had to give a source. And that's another reason why it's remarkable, something I've thought about in the past. Why is it that when wars in the 60s, there were graphic videos that would appear, you would see it, and you would be like, wow, you can go on YouTube and you can see it. And and this is in the 60s. And yet nowadays, why is it that we rarely see any images of an actual war taking place? You would think that
Right.
with the advent of technology and cell phones and that, and people,
Except for the videos that get out by, the guy who slips out, the helicopter video of gunning down the whole family and the little boy, et
yes,
cetera. I mean,
yes.
occasionally stuff like this will slip
Hmm.
out, but that's about the extent of it. And it's not coming from the media. I mean, the media will report it once the
If
story
it
is
comes out,
leaked.
that's
Right.
true. That's true.
Right.
That's true. Right, and that's just something for people to think about, and that alludes to the truth that media, it's controlled. You have wars that took place in the 60s, and we were able to get information and video footage even back then. Here we are, 40 years later, almost, yeah, 44 years later, and, or let's just say 40 years later, and it's more difficult now for us to get actual video footage of particular wars that are taking place. How is that possible? Well, the reason why is because media's relationship to the masses is quite different now than it was in the 60s. Nowadays, it's about control.
Now we have video game representations.
Well, that's true too. That's true. I guess that's the evidence and proof that people need.
Yeah. We're just gonna show you this clip from this video game graphics representation of the war.
That's what they did with Osama bin Laden. And the supposed
Exactly. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous, and people actually buy this stuff up. So, how is fear the third major contributor to the conscious mind's inability to define an element or solve a problem?
Yes. Fear is important because what takes place in the body, hormonally, physiologically, fear induces these two options of fight or flight. If you're going to flee, you're not going to be thinking about the problem. You're trying to just simply get away. If you're going to fight, unless you're a trained fighter, you're not going to be thinking about fighting. You're just going to be going out. You're going to be going all out. It's survival mode. Okay. So what happens is that fear, emotionally, the emotion of fear, hormonally, physiologically, what takes place in the body, it's not about thinking. Right? It's about fighting or fleeing. And therefore, just the change in the body and what takes place hormonally within the body, it's the antithesis of what needs to take place for critical thought and intellectual process. And so fear is an important aspect of this. And that's why if you go onto the news, everything is fear-based. It's about death, destruction, war, and gore. So people are bombarded with all this fear 24 hours a day. And then we wonder why people can't think critically. Well, if you're always in a state of fear, you're either in flight mode or fight mode. Most people are in flight mode. You're not going to be thinking critically, and you won't even have the intellectual aptitude while you're so fearful to think critically about any given thing. And that's why fear needs to be taken a look at, especially as it relates to mass media, because it's all about fear 24 hours a day.
All right, so going from that, is 9/11 used to trigger fear in people via the subconscious mind to think it's happening in the present?
Yes, yes. And the protocol to induce the fear is through trauma. In other words, you represent the stories that re-traumatize people and it triggers the fear. Again, trauma brings forth fear, brings forth the externalization of power. Fear isn't the end goal either, because people have said, well, what's the end goal? The end goal is not fear. Because people can go and they can watch movies to get fearful, right? They can listen to particular types of music and become fearful. The end goal is to cause people to externalize power. So in essence, the trigger stories, we've seen them all lined up this year. They're going to happen next year. They're happening in 2016, 17, 18, and it'll keep going until some other event takes place that is more graphic and gruesome than September 11, 2001. And that will be the focal point. That will be the main event. But what happens is that out of the fear, ultimately, people are led to externalize power, and that's how people are controlled. As an excellent example, and I know we talked about this earlier. Under normal circumstances, if people were thinking critically and they haven't been compromised by this emotion of fear, and they had not ultimately externalized power, there's no way that people would have agreed and stood for and been okay with the Patriot Act.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the whole idea of it is, to slip it through, and they just pounded it through. They had to have had this massive document ready way beforehand. It was not written post 9/11. So, what about the realization that the U.S. is vulnerable, even if it's an inside job?
Well, that's part of the inducement of fear. You see, that's something that I've talked about in one of the lectures. I think it was the one I did in Philadelphia. That the lack of response and the fact that it took place, whatever person believes that it was an inside job or otherwise, the issue is that the U.S. government did not respond adequately. But I would propose that a lack of response put more fear in people and therefore cause people to externalize even more power onto the government. So then on the back end now, the government can step in and propose something like the Patriot Act as a solution, or the quote unquote war on terror as a solution, or supposedly going into Iraq for weapons of mass destruction as a solution. So in essence, when we talk about a timeline, strategically speaking, it was okay. And I know this sounds, I just have to say this. Strategically speaking, it makes more sense for the government to not respond adequately and allow for the levels of fear to occur and the levels of externalization of power to occur, because ultimately it is to the benefit of the government. Because ultimately, therefore, after all of this takes place, the government can now come in with a solution, the problem, reaction, solution kind of response. And therefore, the solution that is brought in, the higher the degree of the externalization of power, the more egregious the solution can be. And the more, and therefore, people will accept this egregious solution. Does this make sense? I know that sounds macabre for me to phrase it like that.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It makes total sense.
Okay.
That's why I'm laughing. It's just like, oh, geez.
I know, and I didn't want to say it that way, but that's the truth. Okay? That is the
Well,
truth.
it makes a whole lot of sense. So, what about the fear of what happens when you realize it's an inside job, or those that you thought you could trust, you realize that you can't trust?
Yeah, that's the betrayal part. I can say that I felt betrayed once I realized that the official version, all the holes in the official version, just building 7 in of itself, I recognized, um, I've been betrayed. And see, I think for you it was different because you were at a certain point in your own development to where you can ask the critical questions. But where I was at when this event took place in 2001, I wasn't there. I wasn't where you were at. So, and what I mean by that my intellectual aptitude at that time was such that I accepted what I was told without any critical thought. And therefore, I believed. And oftentimes what happens is that when you believe in something so strongly, like mass media, and in this case, the mainstream news, when you believe into it to such a degree, and then ultimately you realize that what you were being told was a lie, it does have an impact on you. Like you feel betrayed. You may even feel, kind of depressed about it. And I can say that I felt the same way. But for me, what it also illustrated was that it was going to be necessary for me to build up my intellectual aptitude to start thinking critically about things. And as a result, I've gone on this path that has brought me up to this point. I'll continue to grow, but it's brought me up to this point. And so out of, the ashes, if you will, of being betrayed in that way, I didn't take it as that somehow, all is lost. I didn't look at it like that. I looked at it, okay, now what is there to gain by me reaching beyond this paradigm of falsehood, or this paradigm of illusion? And mass media, what it produces for most people is this paradigm of illusion. Coming to an awareness of the illusion isn't necessarily a bad thing. In point of fact, when you come into the truth as to the illusion, you transcend the illusion itself. When you come into the truth of September 11, 2001 and the cyclical timeline programming, what I call the 9/11 fear-based mind control programming, it actually empowers you, and therefore you can make a conscious choice to experience something greater. And that's precisely what I've done since September 11th. Once I began to realize that the official version and my belief wasn't true. I was basically believing in an illusion. I think a lot of us, we've had that experience.
Does fear cause a problem with the creation of proper solutions to the problem?
Yes, because any solution, you have to have critical thought, and you have to be able to think intelligently about things. When you're in a state of fear, you do not have critical thought or at least not to the degree that you would normally have, and you're not able to solve problems when you're in a state of perpetual fear. That's the thing too, that because people are in a state of perpetual fear, it becomes more difficult to solve problems. It'd be different if we had breaks in between. But in point of fact, what we receive from mass media 24 hours a day is based, it's all fear based. It causes divisions amongst people. It causes people to hate other people. It causes people to be fearful of other people. Where it's a fear paradigm. It's a fear culture. And that's the greatest means of control. I say inside the book that the greatest means of control is not actualized through military might, physical subjugation, or brute force. The greatest means of control is actualized through the manipulation of the psychological condition of the human species. And the best way to manipulate a person's psychological condition is to induce fear. And anytime you induce fear, people have a very difficult time solving problems, defining undefined elements, and then you perpetuate the cycle of the externalization of power.
So, returning, excuse me, what happens when the subconscious mind is constantly traumatized?
Again, the event, the initial trauma is layered even deeper, and it becomes even more difficult for the subconscious mind to process.
So each time they re-trigger it, it buries itself deeper in and gets harder to correct itself, you're saying?
Yeah, well, the triggering really leads up to the reinstallation. Again, there's three phases of what I call the 911 fear-based mind control program that is based upon this subconsciously submerged trauma. The first stage is the installation. We've already talked about that on September 11, 2001. In the case of those who did not see the event of September 11, 2001, it would be for you, it would be when you first saw the graphic footage. That's your installation. For children who weren't born on that day and then at school they're shown it, the graphic footage, well, that would be their installation. So you have the installation, you have the triggering of the trauma, which takes place within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11. But this triggering of the trauma is not the end goal. The triggering of the trauma is to get people to September 11 of every single year. In this case, tomorrow, September 11, 2014. So you trigger the trauma, subconscious mind thinks that September 11th is about to happen or is happening. And then now here we are on September 11, 2014. This is the reinstallation. And the reinstallation takes place when people participate in this morbid death ritual. Once they participate in the morbid death ritual, that's in the subconscious mind interprets this morbid death ritual as if September 11, 2001 is happening all over again. Now you have another layering of this initial trauma. Okay, so tomorrow, for those of us who watched September 11, 2001 unfold, tomorrow being September 11, 2014, if you abide to the script and you've been triggered and then you participate in this morbid death ritual, and you become fearful all over again, now what you're doing is you're layering that trauma now to the 13th degree or the 13th level down from the liminal. In other words, the difference between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, there is the liminal. That's the line of demarcation between the conscious mind and subconscious mind. Now your subconscious mind has layered this initial trauma down 13 levels deep. The further and further it's layered down deep, the more triggering of that trauma, the more embedded it becomes, and therefore the more difficult it becomes for people to ultimately resolve, or for the subconscious mind to resolve that trauma.
How is we must never forget a trigger term? And, and I want to go into all these trigger terms that you discuss because, we'll talk about them more here in a second. I think I put more on there, but we must never forget. Talk about that.
Yes. This is a form of mind control. Sometimes words can be used to embolden the effect of the embedded trauma. In other words, to embolden the degree to which this embedded trauma exists within the subconscious mind. And if you tell someone we must never forget, what that means is that you should always be thinking about, and not necessarily consciously, but on a subconscious level, you should always be thinking about September 11, 2001. In other words, you should always be thinking about the potential of a terror attack.
And you should always be in that state of fear and trauma.
There you go. So we must never forget. We must remain vigilant is another one, right? These phrases also tap into the subconscious mind because we must never forget all memories are stored within the subconscious.
Right. Thank you, Madison Avenue, for creating those.
Another thing that is often used amongst politicians, is believe. They'll say something like believe. We have to believe, and that can be their whole campaign slogan. And there's been politicians who've used it over and over again.
Oh, sure. Obama was
yes. One. Anytime you're dealing with belief, you're dealing with fantasy, you're dealing with the imagination. Okay, now we're dealing with the subconscious mind. So there's particular phrases that we have been indoctrinated into accepting that literally triggers a trauma and further, fortifies a particular embedded trauma. And one of them happens to be we must never forget. And so usually in and around September 11th, you start seeing these types of trigger words. There's trigger stories, but there's also trigger words. You see these trigger words in the news and you see them say things like, we must never forget, especially on the anniversary. We must remain vigilant because there's a potential ISIS attack. Nothing ever happens. Or there's a potential Al-Qaeda attack, a credible but unconfirmed terror threat. It's credible but unconfirmed. What does that mean, right? These terms ultimately cause the listener or the viewer to relive or to be placed in a position to where they must relive aspects of the initial trauma. And so as long as you tell people that they must believe or that they must never forget, what in essence what it does is it triggers a trauma, and then on a certain level it means that you must never heal because you're always thinking about the potential of a terror attack. And I think that that's part of the programming that we receive in the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th, but especially on September 11th, the anniversary of September 11th of every single year. They always say that we must never forget. Now, I'm telling people, no, what you need to do is heal in the first place, heal the trauma, and then forget about it, because there's all kinds of other things that you can be doing with your life than to be stuck in this morbid death ritual paradigm that people participate in tomorrow. They will participate in because why? We must never forget.
Let's talk about the color levels in the media after September 11. They had the red, the yellow, and the green. What was the terror level threat? It was this, what was this all about?
Yes. The color scheme is important because now we're getting into what has been called neuro-linguistic programming. And that is that people can react to certain things based upon information, symbols, words, phrases. We must never forget. Also colors. Color and sounds too. Sounds can impact people in particular ways. But
is that like while you're talking right now, if I toss my arm over my left shoulder, I'm calling you a lefty?
Well, that's possible. There's different types of techniques that people use. As an example, and if you look at the mainstream news, oftentimes what they do is when they're reporting on something, they'll have their scroll bar going down on the bottom.
Right.
And what happens is that scroll bar, it's sensory overload. Right. So they're talking, and then they have these monitors going on in the background. Right. And these monitors, they may be talking about something totally different than what is inside the monitors. But the idea is that we want to give you sensory overload. We also want to give you conflicting information. And what this does is it enacts a level of psychological confusion. And therefore, now we gain access to your subconscious mind. Well, colors can also have the same effect. If you walked into a room that was all red, you're going to feel a particular way. Right. If you walk into a room that is green, you're probably going to feel a little bit calmer. Right. But this issue of red, so the terror, because that was fascinating. I was thinking to myself, what are we in preschool? There's a terror threat meter, and they would raise it arbitrarily. They lower it arbitrarily, raise it, lower it, and the severe level was red. Obviously, yeah, you make it red.
Living up here in the San Bernardino Mountains, when you drive up the mountain, there's a sign that the forestry department has out there for the summertime. In the wintertime, it's green. In the spring, it's yellow. And in the summer, it's red, right? Yep. For fire warning. So that's basically what they're doing, except it's totally arbitrarily set.
Absolutely.
All right. So, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. It's just that the colors can also indicate it can stimulate in the population a particular emotional or psychological response, the colors themselves. So if you say high terror alert, it has to be, you don't say high terror alert and then it's green. No, right. It has to be red. And then the level below that would be orange. The level below that would be yellow. And then the level below that would be green. Right. So that's part of the scheming. And it's a form of what people call neuro-linguistic programming, which is simply managing a person's perceptions of reality based upon the language that you use, the phrases that you use, the numbers that you use, the color schemes that you use, even the body movements that you use, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And we're actually preparing shows to expose both neuro-linguistic programming and nonviolent communication as forms of that type of control. Mm-hmm. Now, let's see. What are some of the other trigger items, words, and terms used? I know you talk about films. You talk about all kinds of stuff. Let's go into some of that.
Yes. Let's just use a recent example. There was a film that came out. I used to watch the cartoon when I was a child titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yeah.
And I used to love that cartoon. I used to watch it all the time.
I think I was probably in high school or something when that came out, but I do remember playing the video game a couple times later.
I played the video
Nintendo,
game.
Right?
Me too. It was an awesome game. It was kind of difficult, but it was awesome. They used to call me Lenon Nintendo back then because I used to play a lot of video games, and I had an ability to see the pattern of the video game, so I could memorize the pattern. Because back then the AI was always ran the same pattern every single time, and based upon memorizing the pattern, it would only take me playing the game a couple of times. I can beat the games very easily. So they used to call me Lenon Nintendo, but I remember playing that game. um, as an excellent example, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, that movie recently came out here in the States. And then it's going to be premiering, I believe, in Australia tomorrow. And what was done is that the poster for the one that was released in the States is quite different than the one that was released in Australia, which premieres tomorrow on September 11th. And the one that's going to premiere tomorrow, the poster for the one for 9/11, and on the poster it says 911. They have the turtles jumping from a building that's exploding. And if you look, and the building's in the background, but what it looks like, it's just a reminder because you see September 11th, you associate the picture with September 11th, and then you see in the background this exploding building. What it does,
and it's all subconsciously.
Absolutely.
You see it, right? And
Absolutely.
then you see the teenage Ninja Turtles falling from the building, just like the people jumping out of the building
Absolutely.
trying to save themselves from the fire.
Yeah. Now, most people, they won't see it consciously because it's all subconscious, but it's meant to be subconscious because that's where the trauma is submerged within the subconscious mind. So that's an example of a trigger. In that case, a trigger poster. But there's a lot of different triggers. Let me just run down the list. There's trigger words, and you remember this. I'm sure you remember this, Jan, because shortly after September 11th, when all the politicians started coming out and giving their speeches, there were particular phrases terms that they would use and repeat over and over again. And one of them was terror.
Terror. There's actually a video out there that shows it. Terror.
Yes, over and over again. Terror, terrorism, terrorist, Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, terror, over and over and over again. Those are trigger words. So here are some of those: terror, terrorism, terrorist, false flag terror, attacks, bombs, bomb plots, suicide bombings, ground zero, plane crashes, inside job, building 7, controlled demolition, axis of evil, patriotism, national security, Arab Spring. Weapons of mass destruction. I know that's absolutely fascinating. Terrorists, they have a season for some reason. We call it Arab Spring. Okay, weapons of mass destruction. These are all trigger words. There's also trigger images of Osama bin Laden, images of Al Qaeda, the Twin Towers, terrorists, etc. There's a whole lot of trigger images. There's also trigger sounds. Trigger videos would be stock footage of September 11, 2001, footage of Osama bin Laden, footage of Al Qaeda, footage of George Bush at Ground Zero, which they used to show that over and over again. Now, there's also trigger movies. The G.I. Joe movie series is an excellent example of that. Zero Dark 30, SEAL Team 6, The Raid on Osama bin Laden. Even Loose Change is a trigger movie. If you haven't healed the trauma, it's still going to trigger the trauma.
I wanted to ask you about that. How is Loose Change a trigger film? Because most people think that that Jason Burmis and Dylan Avery, who made that film, that they're exposing 9/11, but you say it actually triggers.
Yes, and the reason why is because until a person resolves the trauma, any given movie is dealing with September 11th, they're still going to trigger the trauma, right? Just because someone gives their idea about who they think did it and why doesn't necessarily resolve the trauma of the event. That's why, and from my vantage point, I'm not so much concerned about who I think did it and why. I don't even talk about that with people because usually people get into arguments. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is healing the trauma first, because one cannot ultimately come into a level of adequate intellectual process to get to the truth about September 11th in terms of who did it and why, unless they resolve the trauma. Because otherwise, what's going to take place is they're re-traumatizing themselves. And in the process of re-traumatizing themselves, they're succumbing to levels of fear, even if it's on a subconscious level, and which compromise the intellectual process. Well, then how are you going to tell someone who you think did it and why if your intellectual processes have been compromised in the first place because your trauma has been triggered in the first place? So from my vantage point as a logic stream, it becomes necessary for people to heal the trauma first and then start to pursue the truth. I have my own opinions about who I think did it and why, but that's not something that is really relevant to me at this point. What's most relevant is for people to deal with the trauma, which is why I focus on that inside the book. The other thing I want to mention is that the film Loose Change, when I first saw it, I thought it was just awesome. But over the years, because I went back, I think it was about 6 months ago, and I watched it again, and I realized that as a production, it left a lot to be desired. In other words,
it's got huge gaping holes in it.
It really did. And in point of fact, on some level, I felt, I don't know, this may be harsh to say, but I felt disappointed in myself because when I saw that film, I accepted it as being the preeminent representation of the truth even though there wasn't really truth being shared in a sense, like in terms of who did it and why. And so in that sense, I was kind of disappointed in myself. And part of it was that when I saw that during that time, when I saw that film, I was at a particular level in my own intellectual growth. And I wasn't asking critical questions to the degree that I ask critical questions now. So when I reviewed the film, I recognized that in essence, it really wasn't meaningful to the degree that I thought it was. And as a consequence, when I thought it was so meaningful, that's when I went on this barrage about, false flag terror attack and yelling at people and telling people you're sheeple and you need to watch this film over and over again. But now when I go back and I look at it, I realize, you know what, that was just another paradigm. So in this, another paradigm of fear, because it didn't.
Right. In one way, though, it does at minimum at least possibly lead people to begin to question, which is
Yes.
key.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
so,
Yes.
I think, like possibly in your case, it led you to understanding all you do today, whereas if you didn't have that, maybe you would have started piecing things together later in life, or maybe
Or
you
not at
wouldn't
all.
have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not for anyone who may be viewing this. I'm not saying that you shouldn't watch the film or that somehow it's not worth taking a look at. What I'm saying is that there's different levels of understanding, and that in point of fact, there are particular films that even may trigger the trauma, but they may also get you on a particular path to moving forward in your own intellectual process. The idea is don't get stuck there, because I've seen a lot of people who got stuck on that paradigm, and it's just everything's an inside job. Everything is a false flag terror attack. Everything is about externalizing power, and yet no truth is really being revealed about who really did, who really carried out September 11th and why. Okay, so in that case, with that film, that was kind of like the end effect for me, but at least it got me on a particular path. Okay, so these are trigger movies. Other trigger movies would be the Transformers movie series. There's a lot of Muslim extremist propaganda inside of that particular film. Innocence of Muslims, Captain America, the First Avenger. That's all about
I
patriotism.
think when we were in San Diego, you had mentioned Iron Man 3, right?
Oh yes.
What can you had said something significant about that, and I've forgotten what it was. What was
Yes.
that about?
Yeah, not that particular film is very important to view, especially when we talk about Osama bin Laden and the archetype what I call supervillain archetype.
Oh, yeah. So the superhero, supervillain archetype. Yeah, let's make sure we definitely cover that. Sorry.
Yes, and in that particular film, Iron Man 3, and I don't have that one in the book because I wrote the book before that movie came out. It's a fascinating expose in terms of the creation of these supervillains. And if you watch that film, what they really reveal in that film is the process through which these supervillains are created, including supervillains like Osama bin Laden. I found that to be very fascinating because there's this archetype, this supervillain archetype in the film. I can't remember his name right now. But he looks like Osama bin Laden. And he's perceived to be, the leader of this terrorist organization. But later on, we find out that he's just, an actor who plays a particular role, and that he's controlled by, other forces and they control him. They tell him what to say, and everything is a props. They have these whole productions that are put together, and he's talking all these terrorist threats, just like Osama bin Laden, or at least what people perceive to be Osama bin Laden. But the interesting thing was that the main character in Iron Man, the hero figure, when he goes and catches this supervillain archetype, he actually replays the timeline. Well, not the timeline. He replays these purported events leading up to SEAL Team 6 catching Osama bin Laden. I mean, he goes into this compound and he fights, and he gets into he goes up these stairs. Right? It's just like what they talk about in the quote unquote official version and account of the supposed assassination of Osama bin Laden. But really, in the movie, what they're illustrating is how these boogeymen are actually just created out of thin air. They're not.
It's like going back to the old Bruce Lee films, isn't it, and stuff like that, where he's fighting the lower guy and he works his way up to the top. It's just like on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yes.
You work up the levels. So this is what they're doing in the movies. This is what they do in their representation of capturing and killing Osama bin Laden, etc. It's all based on a video game, basically, right?
Yes, and it's based upon comic book lore as well. A lot of what we see with these
right, absolutely, and we've actually been exposing a lot of the the comic book stuff and related to the X. X is actually a symbol for eugenics. And, like Xbox or X-Men or
X-Men.
Ecstasy, all of this stuff. And when you get into the history of that, when you look up X, those who are, in a lot of the story, those who don't have the X are marked to be, or some are going to be killed, others are not going to be killed. I'm forgetting the quote off the top of my head. I discussed it with Joe and the gang in the round table a couple weeks ago. If people want to go back to the round tables and check that out. What other cyclical events are used in the media?
Yes. And this is an important point to make. Once I realized the programming with September 11th and the cyclical nature of that programming, it became apparent to me that not only it wasn't just September 11th. September 11th is the main event because the trauma of that particular event and the impact that that trauma had globally. That's the first time in human history. Nothing can compare to that. Nothing can compare to this impact, and the impact has been totally underestimated by the global population. But there are also lesser events, lesser traumatizing events, wherein when the anniversary comes around, mass media starts to report on again. And so in my book, I put together a chart, and I don't list all of the ones. I list some of the ones. What happened? Let me explain it because I found this to be fascinating. The more traumatizing a particular event is, the more likely that it's going to be represented on the anniversary, and the longer its longevity will be. In other words, a particular traumatizing event that may be a level 1 trauma will only be regurgitated in the news, let's say, for the following year.
So what you're saying is that if you're not successful in getting this message out to the public in 100 years, they'll still be looking at 9/11 repeats?
Yes, unless another globally traumatizing event occurs that is
Right.
far
That
greater
is
than.
farther. So if they stage an even bigger magic show for the public. Right. Got it.
And then September 11th is no longer the main event, but it will be considered to be a lesser event. Okay.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that if an event is like, say, level 1 of traumatization, then it will be carried on for, let's say, for another year. Level 2, maybe for 2 years. Level 3, it'll be carried on for 3 years. Level 4, 4 years. In the case of September 11th, let's just call that a level 8. So, well, in this case, it's been repeated now for 13 years. Let's say that's a level 15 because it's going to continue for, probably the next 10 years at least. But what happens is that the longevity, therefore, of a particular cyclical event, or in other words, the recycling or the regurgitation of a particular event, its longevity is directly related to the degree of trauma that it caused and causes. So what I found, it was fascinating. I realized that there's also these lesser stories that were traumatizing that are regurgitated in the news in and around the anniversary. And then particular stories are brought up that also have a subliminal resonance that can trigger the trauma of that initial event. Let me just get, and you can probably think of even more than what I have inside of the book, but let me just read to you, everyone, just a few of those. Let's say for some people, okay, because now we're getting to race-based programming, the death of Trayvon Martin becomes a central theme. February 26th, took place February 26, 2012. There's a lot of propaganda that will come out in and around there dealing with the death of Trayvon Martin or any other story that can trigger the trauma of the supposed death of, the supposed death of Osama bin Laden, the death of Trayvon Martin, anything that can trigger the trauma, anything that is race-based, it will be reported on during that time. The Japan tsunami, March 11, 2011, the nuclear disaster, the sinking of the Titanic, April 14th, 1912. Again, we had the anniversary of that, the 100-year anniversary, and people participated and asked me to put on this whole show. It was incredible. That was the 100-year anniversary. In addition to the trauma, the degree of the trauma giving a certain shelf life to particular stories and the recycling of these particular stories, also on the 1-year anniversary, 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary, 25-year anniversary, 50-year anniversary, 75th anniversary, and 100-year anniversary, that's when mass media goes all out, assuming that the story has longevity, okay? Or the regurgitation of the story has longevity. Another one is the Oklahoma City bombing, April 19th, 1995. The Columbine shooting, 1999. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, 2010. I have a documentary, Media Mind Control, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Also now, May 2nd, the death of Osama bin Laden, always brought back up inside the news. Aurora Theater shooting, the Oslo twin terror attacks, which is a fascinating example in and of itself, is always brought up. The John F. Kennedy assassination. We just had what year anniversary was that? The 50-year anniversary? Yeah, we just had the 50. Yeah. Was it 50?
63, so 50 would have been last, November?
Yeah. Okay, so last November, we had the 50-year anniversary, and they had a whole big retrospective thing. It was a whole big deal in the news. But again, that's the 50-year anniversary, 25, 50, 75, 100-year anniversary. Another, and people don't think about this, but another cyclical program timeline event is actually October 31st, which happens to be Halloween. That's also an example of trauma-based programming as well. These are some of the examples. There's other ones that people can probably think about. I'm sure there's a whole bunch that you can think about, but you will see these types of stories come back inside the news or stories related to these particular traumatizing events. And again, the more traumatizing these events are, the more media uses those, but they all pale in comparison to September 11th, 2001. September 11th and the anniversary is mass media cyclical timeline main event.
And then there's something regarding the Oslo, Norway event. Why don't you talk about that? Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, yes. Fascinating how this was done. Again, this is media manipulation, and in a sense, it's subconscious programming that triggers the trauma of September 11, 2001. The Oslo terror attacks, or what people call the Oslo terror attacks, what mass media did was that they gave it a particular name, and they called what did they call that? The
twin terror, right?
Yeah, they called it the twin terror attacks.
Right.
Okay.
And so the twin tower attacks, the twin terror attacks,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So the subconscious mind will make an association between the two. And then they called the Oslo attacks, they called it Norway's 911. Okay. Even though there's no comparison between it, there should be no comparison made, but the terminology that is used and the similarity in terminology, and then calling it Norway's September 11th or 911, what that did was that it emboldened and made the Norway quote unquote twin terror attacks seem a lot worse than what it really is. And in a sense, by making it seem a lot worse than what it really was, what happened was that the degrees of fear that was summoned in the global population, and especially in the people who are in Norway, was a lot greater than it would normally have been. Okay, so that's a level of manipulation. In other words, you can take a story and you can propagandize it in a particular way by giving it a particular name, associating with other horrifying events, and therefore the terror that is created out of that event is emboldened. It is increased, and therefore the impact that it has, the trauma that it has on the global population, or in this case, people in Norway, will be greater than it would have been had you not taken the time to call it Oslo's twin terror or Norway's 911.
I wonder if they, claim that the Muslims, and when you pull it right up, a lot of Zionist stuff pulls up in the first reports on it. But I wonder if they tried to claim that the Muslims were jealous of the socialist monarchy there, as Bush claimed that the terrorists were jealous of our freedom.
What did he say? He said they hate us for our freedom.
They hate us for our freedom. I wonder if the terrorists hated Norway for their socialist monarchy.
Right. And then the interesting, he says they hate us for our freedom, so now we need to pass the Patriot Act.
Right.
Because it's going to make us more free.
So, what can we do to prevent this cyclical fear that's coming from the media? What can we do to prevent it from affecting us?
Yeah, so media's going to do what it's going to do. We don't have much control over that. People think that they do, but media really just provides a service, and for some people, fear is what they look for.
And thank goodness the mainstream media is doing financially very poorly, and they're losing droves of people to shows like this.
Yeah, and also just the fact that we have the internet nowadays. I think a lot of people, especially a lot of younger people, are tuning out from the television in general,
right,
and moving on to. I think that
they stare at their phones for their mind control now.
Yeah, I know. Now that's definitely not a good thing. Now, what was your question? Your question was, So what can we do about this? Well, my whole approach to this particular issue of what I call the 911 fear-based mind control program is, in the first place, just see the program, see it, and think of it like just a script that is replayed. When people see it that way, it's like how you were saying earlier. Like sometimes we should just laugh at ourselves and laugh at how we were ignorant about certain things, and it's okay. Just be okay with that. I know I believed the official story for a while. Okay, we'll just laugh at that. Okay, and then move on. Right. That's part of it. I think to see things for what they really are, and in this case, see the program. That's why the book is really designed to help people to see the program, see the types of stories in advance. You know what's going to come down the line, and therefore, when the stories come out, you don't succumb to the fear like a lot of people right now. They're antsy. They're anticipating a terror attack. Nothing ever happens, but they still anticipate. And this has been going on for 13 years now. Even if something happens next week, what that means is that 13 years of this type of psychological warfare and trauma, trauma-based mind control program, 13 years for one event, it's still unreasonable. We shouldn't think like that, and we shouldn't accept that as being a paradigm that's reasonable. So for me, it's important for people to see the program. I outline it inside the book. The other thing, inside the book, I talk about the things that a person can do to heal the trauma, because that's an important aspect of this. When you heal the trauma, even when the stories come out, because they're going to come out, the stories, they no longer impact you. And there's three things that I recommend. Number one is conscious reflection on the event. In that most of us, our interpretation of September 11th was subconscious, based upon the reasons why I explained earlier, and our inability to find an undefined element or solve a problem, sensory overload, conflicting information, and fear. Therefore, it becomes necessary for us now to begin to at least think about the event consciously. And then that's when you ask critical questions. That's when you start to do the research. You think about the event and how you felt on that day. It's not an emotional thing, though. You look at it from a vantage point of intellectual process more so than emotionalism. Think about the event consciously. So conscious reflection is important. Another thing that you can do is purify your information stream. What that means is that anything that would trigger your trauma as it relates to September 11th, purify it out of your space until such time that you have resolved the trauma. It's okay to watch those movies that are propagandizing, like what is it, the supposed assassin of Osama bin Laden and SEAL Team 6. Yeah, you can watch that movie, but if it triggers your trauma, it's going to be unhealthy. So if you heal the trauma first, then at least if you decide to watch that movie.
You could maybe just go to watch it as a comedy, right? Because it is actually a comedy.
But that's what I mean. If I go and watch it, I'm not impacted by it in a way that's negative.
You're just laughing at it and their whole representation of it.
Absolutely. See what I mean? How the shift in orientation, as opposed to it impacting me and making me fearful or making me believe in illusions, I laugh at it and I see it as a joke that it is. And my wife, we do that all the time. We watch certain films and we can tell, and we just laugh about it because we know what the script is. We look at the news reports too oftentimes. We'll just go on to CNN, Reuters, Fox, BBC, what have you, and we look at the headlines and we'll just start laughing. And we look at the types of things that are reported on in the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th. We actually laugh about it. Now, that's because we've healed the trauma to a particular degree to where these stories don't trigger the trauma. So therefore, we have a different perspective and a different orientation to these things. And I would recommend that people seek to have a different orientation. And one of the things you can do, of course, is to purify your information stream. Anything that causes you to feel as if a terror threat is about to happen, anything that triggers the trauma of September 11th, any news reports, any information streams that would cause you that level of fear, you have to start to eliminate them out of your space until such time that you heal the trauma. The third thing and most important thing that people can do is to internalize power. People have truly underestimated the political, social, economical, and even religious impact that September 11, 2001 has had on the planet. And in this sense, what has happened mainly has been the externalization of power. That was what it was really all about. As a trauma brings forth fear, brings forth the externalization of power for the purpose of control.
This is ritual magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a protocol. And you not just with September 11th, it is a form of magic, if you will, especially to those who do not see the program and do not see this protocol that takes place, and not just with September 11th, but with many other events. Many different sources do this. Many different media sources do this to people. But what the point that I'm getting at is that what ultimately happened for the global population was the externalization of power, so that now we accept the Patriot Act or the war on terror. Now we're going to Iraq because they have weapons of mass destruction with no evidence or proof. What happened was the externalization of power was so great. And therefore, if that was the ultimate effect that all of the trauma and fear brought forth, then it will become necessary for us to internalize power. And in the book, I talk about the importance of internalizing power and how that is part of the healing process. If something was taken away, or if we gave something away, if we externalize power, then it's going to be necessary for us to claim the power, right? We have to take it back in a sense. And how do we take it back? It's all about psychology and it's all about the mind. You take it back by empowering your mind so that you're not subject to the mind control program. And therefore, you can see things clearly. And therefore, your traumas are not being manipulated, not being triggered. And it's a very empowered place to be. I am not fearful of Al Qaeda or ISIS for that matter. I'm not fearful of George Bush or the Illuminati or the global bankers. I have no fear in those regards because I have transcended a particular fear paradigm, and it's a very empowered place to be. And in that, I do not have this level of fear. I'm able to have a level of intellectual process because my intellectual faculties are not compromised.
You have understanding rather than reacting from fear. And you've
Absolutely.
studied it, and you can look at it from the other angle now and see how it's all manipulated. And speaking of that, we've covered how these images mostly affect people in the West. But do these things affect people in the East who were the target of false blame and the target of these false images in the media?
Absolutely. That's another.
And how would they, in your opinion, and then we'll wrap it up here, but how were they affected by that?
Yes. This is another issue that has not been addressed in the way that it should have been addressed, or that it should be addressed. And that is that just as we in the quote unquote West have been impacted by what I call the 911 fear based mind control program and all the propaganda, and a lot of the propaganda is the demonization of Muslims or the demonization of the quote unquote Eastern world or the demonization of the Islamic, speaking countries, so forth and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, that holds a profound impact on our relationship to them as human beings, because when you demonize a person, you dehumanize people, you don't see them as human
And
beings.
divide and conquer, for that
And
matter.
there, I was just about to come to that. There you go, Jan. The effect of the divide and conquer complex, because it is a complex, it has been astounding. You have more people hating people in the East because of September 11th, even though.
Let me just ask you this. Do you remember in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the early 60s in the media and the movies and everything, Muslims were romanticized and
Mhm.
now they're always shown as terrorists? I
Yes.
mean, did something suddenly just click to where the whole, a whole third of the world's population just became like terrorists? And and when you look at the whole thing, you have all of this Zionist-based media, and it's like I said at the beginning of the show, it's clear to me that the evidence points to inside people doing it as well as Israel and the Mossad. I mean, there's very little evidence, if any, that, in my opinion, that Islam was behind it by any stretch of the imagination, except for possibly some shills from Saudi Arabia. But I mean, certainly Saddam Hussein, who was CIA since what, 67? I mean, he didn't do it. So anyway, long story, but go
But
ahead.
you do bring up an important point here, before I move on, and that is this issue of how a whole group of people can be romanticized for a while, and then all of a sudden they're totally demonized.
Right,
That's media manipulation, and it's so
right.
true. It's what you said is so true. A lot of the demonizing propaganda that was coming out had to do with the demonization of people from Japan, right? In the past, also there was a lot of and even in more recent history, there was a lot of demonization about African American men,
Sure.
especially
Well,
especially
or
now.
I lived in Yugoslavia and Serbia, and the Serbs were the terrorists of the world,
Yes,
and
yes.
Slobodan Milosevic was compared to Hitler, and I mean they love to repeat that stupid, this and that group is compared to Hitler, and or this person, that person.
Well, that's no difference than comparing Osama bin Laden to Hitler. There's been comparisons that have been made there,
Sure,
or Al
sure.
Qaeda. So to get back to the question that you were raising, yes, there has been not only an impact on us in terms of the West and the externalization of power, but then also how we relate to people in the East and how we tend to see people in the East, and in particular Muslims. And if y'all think about it, just put yourself in Muslim shoes. These are everyday people like you and me. They have their own struggles. They have children. They're trying to do the best to raise their children. They're trying to help other people. They're loving people. But a lot of people here in the West, not just in the United States, but just in, let's say in Europe and so forth and so on, a lot of people have developed this myth about Muslims, wherein all Muslims are terrorists. They are all haters of our freedom. They're all out to get us, and they must be exterminated. In point of fact, if you go on to if you watch look at the articles, there's trigger articles too, trigger story, trigger articles, and you read through them, and then you look at people's comments below. You all will be amazed at the types of heinous comments that are made about Muslims. And Muslims are just everyday people like you and me. People in the Middle East are everyday people like you and me. It doesn't mean that there aren't any bad people in the Middle East, and it doesn't mean that there aren't any bad people in the Western world either. But the point is that when you demonize a whole group of people or a whole countries, Iran,
Right. Guilt by
right?
association,
Yeah,
ad
guilt by
hominem, the whole
association,
thing.
right? Right. You demonize Iran, you demonize North Korea, you demonize China. When you do this, what you're doing is you're basically dehumanizing everyone who lives in that country. I call that
Right.
the anthropomorphization of a country or of a country's
and
name.
and and dehumanizing the other is key to preparing people to attack or to kill this or that group or whatever. So
There you-
people, you need to be very aware. Sergeants and generals, like in the Vietnam War, you call them gooks so that people will be willing
Yes,
to go in and kill them. Right?
that's right.
It's always dehumanizing. So the media, especially Zionist media, is very gung ho on demonizing Muslims or dehumanizing Muslims, and it's been going on at least since the '60s now. And you can go back and look at movies like from the Lawrence of Arabia days, which of course was a whole British psyop. But from that period, for the next 30 or 40 years, Muslims and Islamic countries were completely romanticized, and you wanted the romance scenes in the movies, and the blonde woman getting romanced by this dark-haired Muslim of this or that, and all of this sort of stuff, and all of that, of course, is completely removed from the media. So, Lenon, what is the single most important concept or idea that you would like people to remember from this interview?
Just that at the end of the day, it's about healing the subconscious trauma, and that part of the process is to internalize power. When you engage in the healing process through the purification of your media stream, through the conscious reflection on September 11th, and then the internalization of power, all of the propaganda that we receive in the news, including the propaganda about Muslims, demonization of Muslims, no longer impact you. And you begin to see it in a different light. And then what you notice, because you step out of this paradigm of what I call the 911 fear-based mind control program, it's really a matrix. You step outside of that matrix, and then you'll be able to see all of those other people who are in that matrix. And then you can begin the process of trying to help others, which is something that I'm attempting to do here. I mean, that's what you're doing, Yan. You're attempting to help people to get out of particular matrices, if you will. This particular matrix that I call the 911 fear-based mind control program is one of the most important things to dissect, because it has global implications, and it's something that has not been looked at, in my opinion, enough from a psychological perspective. So in essence, I want people to really think about, your mental well-being, your mind. Think about clearing out what I call the 911 fear-based mind control program. When you do, you'll find that you will have a level of clarity, especially as it relates to mass media cyclical programming. You'll also tend to be a lot more relaxed and peaceful, and a lot happier too, because your traumas are not being triggered over and over again. I think that that's important, because it's not enough to expose the programming. It's all, part of the exposing the programming is to get beyond the programming so that we can live healthier, happier lives. And I think that one of the issues that we can address is this issue of the 911 fear-based mind control program. By addressing this particular issue and healing the trauma, we will live happier lives. And I think that that is part of the process.
And Lenon, your books, website, etc.
Yes, I have a website, www.lenonhonor.com. I also have another website, lenonhonorfilms.com. The book, you can find it at lenonhonor.com/911, the digits 911. And I'm also on YouTube. I have a video series there on YouTube that I'm producing right now. I think I'm on part 3. I should have part 4 up tomorrow. Well, I hope to have it up tomorrow. The truth about September 11th. And I talk about a lot of the things that Jan and I have talked about here. So I want to encourage people to check out my YouTube page. My YouTube page is Lenon Honor. I want to thank you again, brother, for allowing me to come and speak with you. I do appreciate it. I also appreciate your patience, because we've been trying to get this to happen, and I've been so busy. So I really appreciate the fact that you allowed me to end up coming on your show. I really appreciate speaking with you, and I hope that we can do it again real soon.
Likewise, thanks for coming on, Lenon, and we'll call that a wrap.